Hi and welcome to this lesson on casting. Casting is the process of taking the data type of a variable and changing it into another data type. Now, this becomes incredibly useful as a programmer, and you tend to use it a lot. However, for GCSE, the kind of focus of this becomes around inputs, especially when you're doing Python programming. So that's where we are going to be spending most time kind of considering for this. However, you can use it in other places as well. So we're going to be looking at casting. Now, every single variable has a data type. So here I've got 4 variables created already. Each of them got a different variable. So my x is an integer and my z is a string. So I'm just going to run this code down here. Now, what it will do is it's going to display the data type of each of my variables. So the command type just basically displays or pulls out the data type of a variable. And it's quite useful when we're looking at casting. So I'm going to run this code. And you can see here, the first one says int because we have an integer. So int is short for integer. Then we've got float for floating point. str is short for string. And finally, we've got bool, which is short for boolean, which is true and false. So here I've got my data type. So we're going to be using this type command just to see what happens when we start to use operators with these. Now, I'm going to create a new variable t, and I'm going to add x plus y. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm adding an integer value to a floating point value. So what's the result? Is the result going to be an integer or is it going to be a floating point? So let's see. So I'm going to print out the answer. And next to it, I'm going to print out the data type of t. And let's see what happens. So let's run that. So you can see it says 66.4 class float. So what's happened is it's turned them both into floating point numbers, as you probably would expect, because the answer, if I added those two in real life, would be obviously 66.4, which is a floating point number as you expect. So it has to make a choice. Python makes a choice about which data type to use. This is known as automatic casting. Okay, so it automatically does it for you. Let's see another example of automatic casting. So this time I'm going to do another variable t again, and this time instead of adding x and y, I'm going to divide them. So x divided by y, and then again I'm going to just print the answer out and see the data type. So let's run that. So here it's done the same thing. I've got class float and it's turned it into a floating point number. So this is automatic casting. Now it tends to always cast it to a floating point number. Now, the next thing I'm going to look at is, well, what happens if I start mixing ones which aren't close together, like strings, for example. And this is where casting is required. So I've got a variable z, okay, which is a string. It's just got the word hello in it. And this time I'm going to try and multiply z by x. Let's see what happens. Actually, I'm going to, let's z by x. So I'm going to print z times by x. Let's see what the result is. Now, I don't know what you expected there. What's happened is it's basically printed out hello 60 times. Okay, so it's taken the string hello and multiplied it by 60 by simply repeating the string over and over again. What happens if we divide it then? Let's see what happens. So hello divided by 60. Okay, now we've got an error and it says unsupported operand type s for slash str and int. Now that is a really complicated error message, but actually it's not, if you kind of understand what it's trying to talk about. Operands, if you remember, are things like add, subtract, divide, etc. Types is short for data types. The slash is obviously our divide, because we know that already. str we know is short for string, and int is short for integer. So what it's really saying is, I don't know how to divide a string and an integer. And I'll be honest with you, I don't either. So I mean, what would that even be? What is hello divided by 60? It makes no sense. So Python can't make a sense of that. I can't make sense of that either. Let's try another experiment. This time I'm going to do 2 new variables. So I'm going to have 2 and x equals 50. Now notice z is 2 and x is 50. Okay, but x is an integer and this is a string. Okay, we can see that if I go print x, or type x, sorry. If I run that code now, what we should see is str. So even though it got a number inside the string, it's still a string. So if I try and do this, print x divided by z, and run that, you can see it still gives me that error message. Okay, this is where casting comes into it. I need to basically tell Python that actually my variable x, this string here, is actually not really a string, it's really a number. Okay, because Python can't work that out for itself. So how do we do that? I'm going to go print again, but this time my variable x, I'm going to say, is an integer. So I'm going to write the command int. I'm then going to put x inside it and then divide that by z. Now what I've said to Python is x is now a number, please. So turn it, cast it into a string, change data type, and then do the division. So let's run that and see, bang, I've got 25.0. Okay. The next thing to look at, well, if that works for that, maybe I can do this hello. Well, let's try doing that. So let's go print integer. Sorry, no. Let's go x equals hello again. And this time I'm going to go print int x. So I'm going to cast x into an integer and then print the results. Let's see what happens. And I'll get a really strange error. It says invalid literal for int with base 10 hello. Now, this error message is a bit hard to decipher, but essentially what it's really saying is a literal is just a value that I've typed in, i.e. hello. Int, we already know, is integer, and this is the cast. Okay, so I'm casting it. So with base 10 is our normal numbering system. Okay, so remember, binary is base 2, denary or normal numbers are base 10. So what it's saying is it's invalid to turn this into an integer for the text hello. So hello can't be turned into an integer, basically, is what it's saying. And that makes sense because hello is not a number, so it can't turn it into a number. So casting will only work if the string is a number. So we're going to look at that in a bit more detail and look at where this becomes really, really useful. So here's the beginning program. So we're asking for 2 numbers, we add them up, and then display a total. So let's run this code and see what happens. So I'm going to run the code. And it's asking me for the first number, so I'm going to enter the number 60 and hit enter. Then it's asking me for my second number, I'm going to put 5. So the answer should be 65, but I get 60 as 605. So what's gone wrong? Well, let's add a little bit more code to this. Let's put the type of total. Now, this should be a integer, shouldn't it? Okay, so let's see what happens if I run it again. So run 65, and you can see the answer is 605 and class str. So it thinks that total is a string. So why is that? Before we get to total, let's just see what the data type of num1 and num2 are. So let's go print type num1 and type num2. And let's run this code again. So type in 60, type in 5, and you can see here that it thinks 60 and 5 are both strings. So what's going wrong? The command input always returns a string. Always. Sting, string, string. There we go. Always returns a string, no matter what you do. So we got a problem. We actually want to add 2 numbers together, but we have 2 strings. Even though the strings contain numbers, so 60 is obviously a number, Python doesn't know that yet. So we have to use our cast to actually turn it into an integer. So how do we do that? There's lots of different ways we can do it. The way I'm going to do it, just to be really clear about it, I'm going to go num1 equals int num1 and num2 equals int num2. I'm then going to, just so we can see the results, display the data types. Let's run the code again. So I'm going to go 60 and 5. So let's see what's happened. So the first print here, where it says num1, num2, is displaying two strings. I then do the casts, turn those two strings into integers, and then the second time I call this print, I'm now getting two integers. Now the result is 65, which is the correct answer, but you can see the data type is an int, because if I add two numbers together, I'm always going to get a number. So when we want to get a number in through input, we must cast it. Now you can cast it like I have done here, but there are other ways of doing it. So let's just look at some other examples of how to do this. So I'm just going to get rid of all that code there. Okay, I could, if I wanted to, do this. Go int num1 plus int num2. That will give me the correct answer. So just to prove it, 60 plus 5 is 65. I could do this and go int input. I'm sure you might have seen that style before. And then I can get rid of the ints here. And then that will give me the exact same answer as well. So just to show it, 60 plus 5 is 65. Okay, all three methods are perfectly valid. It's completely up to you which one you use. But the most important thing is, if you want to get a number in through inputs, you must cast it from a string to an integer. Otherwise, you'll get the wrong answer. So input always returns a string. If I want to treat it as a number, then I must use casting. Now there are three ways I can cast a string into a number from an input. So I could do it immediately. Now that is a very common way of doing it. So when you do the input, you immediately do the ints. The reason this works is because the inside here of the brackets always goes first, and then it runs the outside second. Now, if you think about how maths works as well, you always do the stuff inside brackets first and then you work your way outwards. The exact same thing happens in programming. You always do stuff inside brackets first and then you work your way out. So that works that way. Another way of doing it is that when you want to actually do the addition, you actually cast it there and then. So here on the second example, I'm doing my casting just before I do the plus. Now I can't do a plus and then cast the results because it's the plus that's causing the problem. Okay, if I add the numbers together and then cast it to a value, I'll still get 605, or the two numbers put together instead of added. So that won't work. You have to cast the two numbers individually and then add them up. The final way of doing it is a bit more heavy-handed, where I do the inputs and then on two separate lines I do the castings and then finally do the addition. That's third way. I mean, it's useful if you're not sure how to do casting very well and you want to be really clear about it, but I tend not to do that myself. So those are the three ways of casting on an input. So we've looked at the command int, which will cast whatever the variable is into an integer, but there are others as well. The two that you most likely will come across is floats, which will cast a number into a floating point. So here you can see I've got the number 50 and I've cast it to a float. And you can notice that it's put .0 at the end of it. Python will always do that, so it will say 50.0 instead of 50, just the way it does it. We can also cast to a string, so I could, if I wanted to, take a integer number and then cast it into a string. So you can see here, although it says 29, they look almost identical. Notice the data type has changed to a string. It's no longer an integer, so it has cast it. So time for you to do a bit of practice. Now, You need to write a program which will pick two random numbers and ask the user to work out the sum. Now, I've given you the starting code here to do that, so please enter that code first. What you've then got to do is use input to ask the user for their answer, and then compare what they've typed in with what the total is here. Okay, you will need to use casting to an integer on the input in order to get that working. Okay, if they are the same, print well done. If they're not, say try again. Okay, so here's the model answer. Notice that I'm using int immediately after the input. Okay, so remember there are three ways I could have done it. There's actually a fourth way as well, which I'll say just for completeness. So here, where I'm casting the input into an integer, what I could have done is cast this total to a string. Now I do the addition and then I can go str bracket those two things. So we'll cast those two numbers into a string. I then can get rid of this int here. I just leave as input. I'm now comparing two strings together. So the addition was between two integers. I then cast the result into a string and then compare two strings together, and that will still work. So it's a bit more of a odd way of doing it, but it actually is perfectly valid. So challenge. This one requires you to essentially ask the user for a name and say hello to them. So this is something we've done before. There's a little trick here, which I don't know if you'll notice. You'll either get this straight away or you'll get an error. Okay, if you get an error, then just learned a valuable lesson. Okay. So the error you might have got is by just casting everything. So for example, if you put a cast here to an integer, okay, and then did it, what will happen is you'll get an error, okay, because you can't cast a name like Bert or Sally or whatever into a number because it makes no sense. So if you did put cast there, that was incorrect. You just don't need the cast at all. Okay, so no cast because name is a string, you wanted a string, you don't need to change the date type, and that's the way to think. The reason I put this one in there is just really to see if I caught you out with that little trick, because some people just simply use int all the time because they've learned how to do it without actually thinking about why we use int, and only using the casting when we actually need it, not all the time. Okay.